They found his blueprints stuffed inside a wall, not in a museum, not in an archive, inside the actual plaster wall of a condemned building in rural Ohio, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a piece of twine that had turned the color of old blood. The man who hid them had been dead for 30 years, and the aircraft he designed had never officially existed. This is the story of Edmund Callaway, a name you were never supposed to know. The year is 1938. While the world watches Germany rearm itself and Japan push deeper into China, a quiet man in his early 40s is working alone in a converted barn outside Dayton, Ohio. He has no university affiliation, no government contract, no team of engineers backing him up. He has a drafting table, a wood stove, and an obsession that has consumed the better part of a decade. Edmund Callaway was not supposed to be an inventor. His father was a coal man. His mother kept a garden and a Bible and not much else. Edmund grew up in the kind of poverty that teaches you two things early: how to be invisible and how to make something from nothing. He taught himself mathematics from discarded textbooks. He taught himself aerodynamics from papers he found at the public library, papers written by men at universities he would never attend. He built his first glider at the age of 19 and crashed it into a neighbor's fence. He built his second at 21 and flew it for 11 seconds above a wheat field before a crosswind folded the left wing like a piece of paper. He kept building. By 1935, Callaway had developed something that no one in aviation was seriously pursuing yet. He called it acoustic suppression in fixed wing design. In plain language, he was trying to build an airplane that made almost no sound. Not quieter, silent, or as close to silent as the physics of flight would allow. He believed, and this is the part that gets under your skin when you read his surviving notes, that the future of war would not be won by faster aircraft or more powerful engines. It would be won by aircraft that could not be heard until it was already too late. He was right. He was just 40 years early. The concept itself was not magic. It was engineering. Callaway understood that most aircraft noise comes from three sources: the engine, the propeller, and the turbulence created by the airframe moving through air. He attacked all three simultaneously. He designed a low turbulence wing profile that redirected airflow in a way that dramatically reduced the acoustic signature of the fuselage. He experimented with engine shrouding, wrapping the motor in layered, baffling materials to contain its sound. And for the propeller, he developed a blade geometry that is, when you look at the surviving sketches, strikingly similar to what modern noise reduction engineers arrived at independently decades later. He called the aircraft the Callaway Whisper. He never got to fly it. The barn where Callaway worked sat on 12 acres he had inherited from an uncle. It was not much to look at from the road. A dirt path leading back through a line of old oaks, a weathered structure with a rusted tin roof, a single window facing north. Neighbors remembered seeing lights in that barn at all hours. Some said they heard nothing unusual from the property, which in retrospect strikes you as exactly what Callaway intended. Others remembered that his visits to town became less frequent as the years went on, that he would sometimes appear at the hardware store with grease on his hands and a distracted look in his eyes, as if he was still solving a problem in his head while he counted change at the counter. His closest friend during those years was a man named Roy Sutter, a machinist who worked at a tool and die shop in Dayton and who would drive out to the barn on Saturday afternoons to help Callaway fabricate parts. Roy Sutter kept a diary. Fragments of that diary survived. And what he wrote about those visits is the closest thing we have to a first-hand account of what Callaway was building. Sutter wrote, and remember this is a machinist writing, not a poet, that the aircraft in that barn was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen built by human hands. He described a fuselage that looked almost organic, curved in ways that no production aircraft of the era attempted. He described the wing roots as looking like something that had grown rather than been assembled. He wrote that the first time Callaway demonstrated the engine at low power inside the barn, with the doors partially open, Sutter stood 50 feet away and could barely hear it. He wrote that it was like standing next to something breathing. By the summer of 1941, the whisper was nearly complete. Then America entered the war. December 7th, 1941 changed everything for everyone. For Edmund Callaway, it changed everything in a way that was at once predictable and devastating. Within weeks of Pearl Harbor, the military began a systematic process of identifying private aircraft, private hangars, private workshops, and private inventors who might be of use to the war effort, or who might be in possession of materials, facilities, or designs that the government could repurpose or control. This was not unusual for the time. It was wartime. Extraordinary measures were taken. What happened to Callaway was extraordinary even by those standards. In March of 1942, 2 officers arrived at the barn. Callaway was there. Roy Sutter was there. The officers did not present themselves as having come to negotiate or collaborate. They presented documentation. The barn and all its contents were being seized under emergency wartime authority. Callaway had 72 hours to remove personal items. Everything related to the aircraft itself, the blueprints, the engine specifications, the acoustic testing data, all of it was now property of the United States military. Sutter wrote about that day in the last entry of his surviving diary. He wrote that Callaway did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He stood in the middle of the barn floor and looked at the whisperer for a long time without speaking. Then he walked outside and stood in the field with his back to the barn for almost an hour. When Sutter finally went out to stand beside him, Callaway said only one thing. He said, "They will not understand what they have." Sutter never went back to the barn after that. What happened to the whisper after the military seizure is where the story becomes genuinely strange. And this is where you have to lean in, because this is where history starts hiding things. Officially, there is no record. The Army Air Force's documentation from that period, much of which was declassified in stages between the 1970s and the 1990s, contains no reference to a seizure at Callaway's property, no reference to the whisper, no reference to Edmund Callaway at all. This absence is itself a kind of answer. When military organizations in the 1940s seized materials from private individuals that they found useful, they documented it. Meticulously, the absence of documentation suggests one of 2 things. Either the project was classified at a level that kept it out of general records, or someone made a deliberate decision to ensure that no paper trail connected the government to what they had taken. Researchers who have pursued this story over the decades tend to believe it was both. There is a third possibility that no one likes to say out loud. The military seized the aircraft, evaluated it, and then did nothing with it. Not because it was not valuable, but because the men who evaluated it did not understand what they were looking at. Because Edmund Callaway, working alone in a barn in Ohio with no credentials and no institutional backing, had built something that the engineers and officers sent to assess it simply could not process within their existing frameworks. They will not understand what they have. After the seizure, Callaway did not give up. This is the part of the story that breaks you a little when you understand what it must have cost him. He was in his mid-40s. He had spent nearly a decade building one aircraft. That aircraft was gone, but the knowledge that built it was still in his head. He found a smaller space, a rented workshop on the outskirts of Dayton, and he started over. He began rebuilding his design documentation from memory. He began reaching out to people he hoped might listen, engineers he had read about, academics whose papers he had studied, even a few political contacts he had cultivated through sheer persistence over the years. The responses he received, the ones that survived, are almost unbearable to read. Some were polite. Some were dismissive. Most were simply silent. One letter from a mid-level official at the War Department, undated and unsigned, responded to a proposal Callaway had submitted by saying that the department was not in a position to evaluate submissions from unaffiliated private individuals during the current period of national emergency. He tried for 3 years. By 1945, with the war ending and the world reorganizing itself, Callaway seems to have accepted a truth that he had been resisting for years. He was not going to be heard. Not in the way he needed to be heard. He was 50 years old. He had no money. He had no aircraft. He had blueprints in his head and paper and a rented workshop and a silence around him that had grown so complete it had become its own kind of physics. He moved back to the property with the barn. The military had long since cleared out. What they left behind was an empty structure, the remnants of jigs and supports that had held the Whisper during construction. Oil stains on the floor and the outline of the aircraft's footprint. People who knew Callaway in those final years said he would sometimes go into the barn and stand looking at those stains on the floor. Not with bitterness, with something closer to wonder. As if he was trying to see the aircraft that was no longer there. He spent the rest of his life quietly. He took on small mechanical work to pay his bills. He kept a garden like his mother had. He wrote, and this we know because of the blueprints found in the wall, obsessively and privately, reconstructing everything he had lost. Every specification, every calculation, every insight that had come to him over a decade of solitary work. He wrote it all down and he hid it, because he had learned that what he built could be taken from him, but what he wrote and concealed could not. Edmund Callaway died in 1971. He is buried in a small cemetery outside Dayton. His headstone gives his name and his dates and nothing else. For 20 years after his death, the property sat. His few remaining relatives had no interest in it. The barn aged. The oaks grew larger. And inside a wall of the farmhouse where Callaway had lived and worked and hidden what he knew, the blueprints waited. They were found in 1991 by a contractor hired to demolish the farmhouse. The contractor's name was Dennis Hargrove, and by his own account, he almost threw the oilcloth package away, assuming it was old insulation or rags. Something made him unwrap it. What he found were drawings of an aircraft that looked unlike anything he had ever seen in his life, and Dennis Hargrove was old enough to have served in Korea and young enough to have watched the space shuttle launch on television, so he had seen a few things. He brought the blueprints to a local historian. The local historian brought them to a professor of aerospace engineering at the University of Dayton. The professor spent 3 days looking at them before he called a colleague. That colleague spent a week. The word that both of them kept using was not fake or outdated. The word they kept using was prescient. The acoustic suppression principles in Callaway's designs, anticipated by several decades approaches that the aviation and defense industries would pursue openly beginning in the 1970s. The wing profile geometry he developed in a barn in Ohio in the late 1930s has structural similarities to designs that would be produced later with computers and wind tunnels and teams of engineers. One researcher who has studied the blueprints in depth said, and this is a direct quote from an interview given in 2003, that reading Callaway's work is like finding a letter from the future written in pencil on the back of a grocery receipt. No one knows what happened to the Whisper itself. There are theories. There are always theories. Some researchers believe the aircraft was disassembled, studied, and its components destroyed or dispersed among facilities in ways that made the whole untraceable. Some believe it was transferred to a private contractor and absorbed into proprietary research that was never made public. One persistent account, impossible to verify but difficult to entirely dismiss, holds that a covered aircraft matching no known type was observed at a facility in the California desert in the late 1940s by a maintenance worker who had previously worked on conventional aircraft and who described the experience of seeing it as deeply disorienting because he could not make out its engine sound over the ambient noise of the facility. He described it as looking like something breathing, the same words Roy Sutter had used in his diary. What do you do with a story like this? What do you do with a man who was right, who built the thing he said he could build, who had it taken from him by a government that may not have understood what it held, and who spent the rest of his life quietly reconstructing what had been erased, writing it all down in secret, hiding it in a wall, waiting for a world that might finally be ready to understand? You remember him. That is what you do. Because Edmund Callaway is not simply the story of a forgotten inventor or a mysterious aircraft or a wartime seizure that left no paperwork. He is the story of what happens when someone is so far ahead of their time that the world around them simply cannot accommodate the truth of what they know. He is the story of a man who built silence in a barn and found it taken by noise, who spent 30 years writing in secret what he could not say in public, who died with his name on a plain headstone in Ohio while the ideas inside his blueprints traveled forward through time without him. There is a copy of those blueprints at the University of Dayton today. They are not on display. They are in a climate-controlled archive, in an acid-free folder, in a drawer. The professor who first authenticated them retired in 2009. He said in his last public lecture that the Callaway documents were the most significant thing he had encountered in 40 years of aerospace research and the least known. He said that Edmund Callaway deserved a different ending. Outside Dayton, the barn still stands. The farmhouse is long gone. The oaks are larger than ever. If you walked out there on a still day and stood in the field where Callaway once stood with his back to the barn and his aircraft and the two officers who had come to take everything, you would hear almost nothing. The occasional car on the distant road, wind in the trees, birds settling. You might think the silence was ordinary, but some silences were built, deliberately, by a man who understood that what cannot be heard cannot be stopped, and who spent his whole life trying to make the world listen.